So having said all that, I'd like to set the stage by explaining why there's been this increased interest in vintage horror fiction over the past 3 years. And I trace it back to a guy named Grady Hendrix. Now, Grady is a contemporary author of horror fiction. His two biggest books are My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is a teenage possession story, and Horror Store, which is basically about a haunted IKEA furniture store. Do I remember right? Did you read Horror Store?
I did, yes.
So any good?
I thought it was a really cool idea, and the book has this really awesome presentation. It has like this employee handbook stuff built into it.
It looks like an IKEA catalog,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
So it was really innovative in terms of the presentation. The story itself was just okay. It got a bit silly, but I suppose that's really the whole point, right? Just to have fun with a horror story.
Yeah, that's my impression, is that he's kind of doing a send-up sometimes of horror. Anyway, but what I'm talking about here is in 2017, Grady Hendrix wrote and produced this nonfiction book that I have in my hand here called Paperbacks from Hell that basically discusses the twisted history of 1970s and 1980s horror fiction. It's a beautiful book with tons of color photos from the shocking cover art from that era's horror fiction. And in the book, Hendrix explains that he wanted to make Paperbacks from Hell a roadmap for those of us who want to explore this weird era of horror fiction where things were shockingly politically incorrect and just plain shocking compared with today's more cerebral horror fiction that you and I read. Hendrix makes the case that these books were written to be sold in drugstores and supermarkets, and they really weren't worried about causing offense. They were sold with covers designed to grab your eyeballs, and the plots were also often held up to honor the promise of that cover art. They had no inhibitions about sex in their plots, and with the only guiding force being always be interesting. Now, Grady makes the case that until the 1970s and 1980s, horror was kind of stuck back in the pulp era and hadn't evolved in decades. Likewise, horror books also weren't a real big factor in the bestseller lists. He discusses the phenomenon of the gothic romance from the pre-1970s era. Now, you've seen those covers where everyone has a woman running from like a mansion with like one light on upstairs. Grady describes these as adult fairy tales where young governesses fall in love with brooding, mysterious masters of the house, and along the way, the dark secrets of the mansion's history become fully realized. I have never read a gothic novel, but I've always been tempted to, just to find out what that poor girl's running from.
Well, you may disagree with me on this, but you've read Gothic novels. Like the 1970s just had the same formula with the artwork and the girl running from the big house or the mansion on the cover. But think about this, Tom. How many horror novels that we've read where the main character, mostly women, has some sort of obstacle in life that makes them go back to their hometown or back to the family roots or back to dear old dad's mansion to live or visit, and there they confront some sort of childhood terror or killer, and they learn the reasoning behind it. It turns into maybe a mystery. John Saul made millions off of this formula, and the covers could easily have been some beautiful woman running from the mansion.
That's a good point. I guess, the gothic romance is probably more about marketing them than the actual contents of the books themselves. Anyway, so Grady Hendrix makes this really compelling case in his Paperbacks from Hell book that the 1970s and the 1980s changed everything. And he's not just talking about Stephen King. He basically breaks down each chapter of the book by subject matter. And so the book chapters are kind of interesting. Hail Satan, Creepy Kids, When Animals Attack, Real Estate Nightmares, Weird Science, Gothic and Romantic, Inhumanoids, Splatterpunks, Serial Killers, and Super Creeps. In each one of those chapters, he's got color pictures of the best and worst in these horror subgenres and descriptions of the books in these categories. So what Grady has done for you and I, really, is to provide a roadmap to horror fiction of the 1970s and 1980s that genre fans like us can use as a buyer's guide, steering us to the best books from that era. There's even an afterword by a guy named Will Erickson called Recommended Reading that goes through the best of the best to help us out. So if the listener has any interest at all in 1970s and 1980s vintage horror paperbacks, this book is essential. Again, it's called Paperbacks from Hell by Grady Hendrix. It's a $25 paperback, but it's like a remarkably produced coffee table book. It's also available as a Kindle book and an audiobook, but you should have your head examined if you go that route because you lose out on all the cover art that's in there.
This book is awesome, and it's got so much attention to detail. The connection with the plots and stories to real-world social issues was also really cool. And that's really what horror is, a reason to dig in and find out what's wrong. And Grady gets that, and I really love that.
Right. So the next question that the listener's probably wondering is, once I create this reading list for myself, where can I get my hands on the paperbacks from this era? Because Tom and Eric, I'm not made of money. So I got 3 solutions for you. First, don't forget what you already know. All the tricks you use to get your hands on vintage crime and adventure paperbacks also work with vintage horror, right? You got a local used bookstore, maybe you got thrift stores, eBay, garage sales, etc. There's no reason that a horror novel from the 1980s should be more difficult to find than a crime novel from 1959. In fact, it should be a lot easier. Second, your Kindle is your friend. I have found that a way higher percentage of vintage horror novels from the 1970s and 80s are available as ebooks on Kindle than the other stuff that we cover. That's because a lot of these authors and their immediate family members are still alive and want to create revenue from these old books. Downside to the Kindle editions is that you lose the salacious cover art from the original horror paperbacks, but if you can live with that. Anyway, the third solution is my favorite. There's a company called Valancourt Books, owned by this really cool guy named James Jenkins in Richmond, Virginia. Their website is valancourtbooks.com. Anyway, they launched a line of reprints called Paperbacks from Hell that are reprinting the best books profiled in this Grady Hendrix books while preserving the vintage cover art. It's great because they've done all the work for you. There are 18 releases in their Paperbacks from Hell collection, and I got a bunch of them. And each one has a new introduction by either Grady Hendrix or Will Erickson. Some of the titles that jumped out at me and are on my to-read stack right now are, first one, The Nest by Gregory Douglas from 1980. It's about a garbage dump on Cape Cod that the managers changed the formula of their poison control, causing mutations among the cockroaches in the dump. These mutant cockroaches are all about making their nests inside human flesh.
Ugh.
I'm told it's basically an animals attack story like Jaws, but with super aggressive roaches. Again, and it's got a great cover.
Wow.
It's called The Nest by Gregory Douglas. Another one I'm excited to read is called Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mendel Johnson from 1974. The original edition of this book is a huge collector's item because it had a reputation as being real scary, but it never got a big print run, and so copies are being sold for a fortune. The book itself is about a 20-year-old babysitter named Barbara who babysits for the Addams kids. Something happens while she's taking care of the kids, and she wakes up basically bound and gagged by the kids themselves. They're evil kids, and they do awful things to Barbara the babysitter. So that's called Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mendel Johnson. The third paperback from hell I got from Valancourt Books is called The Pack by David Fisher. And this one I did review at paperbackwarrior.com, and I'll give you the highlights right now. David Fisher's The Pack from 1976 was actually popular enough to sustain multiple printings, and it inspired a film adaptation called The Long Dark Night in 1977. And I've seen copies of the paperback under that title also. The prologue begins at the end of the summer season on a fictional island called Burroughs Island, right off of New York, Long Island Sound. The family has a summer dog, a term I'd never heard of before, named Jake, who is adopted to keep the kids occupied during their extended vacation on the island. And now, as a dog person, Eric, you'll appreciate this premise. Rather than taking Jake, the sweet dog, back to the city for the winter, the dad of the family ties the pup up to a tree, leaving him behind while the family ferries off to the island. The hope is that Jake can work himself free of the rope and fend for himself in the wild. It's this heartbreaking scene that made me feel like the humans deserve whatever is going to come their way in this book. Evidently, the abandonment of a domesticated dogs is not unusual on this island. So there's all these orphan pups from together, and they form this pack of like wild animals. But what's funny is that they're golden retrievers, they're Irish setters, they're German shepherds, they're collies. And these dogs form a pack to hunt deer and basically survive on this island throughout the harsh winter. It's interesting because the author clearly went to great pains to make this ferocious pack of dogs populated by the sweetest breeds on Earth. And so seeing this setup, you know this paperback is going to be a lot of fun and probably not going to take itself too seriously. So then the action cuts and we meet the Hardman family. They're Manhattan fancy people who are bringing their kids as well as their basset hound named Dopey to the island for a 2-week winter vacation, knowing that the island is going to be pretty much deserted because it's the snowy off season. So there's not much fat or foreplay at all in this paperback. Things go sideways and get bloody rather quickly, and the mayhem just keeps coming thereafter. The family barricades themselves in their house to hide from this pack of formerly sweet dogs. They can't get help from the mainland police. The neighbors are either gone or they're completely useless. The pack has fantastic tension, mostly to the threat that these mad dogs pose to the family's most vulnerable members. As a horror novel, it wasn't particularly realistic, but there's nothing supernatural happening here either. It actually sort of reminded me of Cujo meets Night of the Living Dead, and had vivid characters being called to unlikely acts of heroism. I could quibble with this or that in the paperback, but why bother? It was a successful thrill ride and a lot of fun to read. Too much analysis is going to spoil this book because it was mostly just disposable escapism. But thank you to Valancourt Press for making it available to modern audiences. I really recommend it. Again, the book is called The Pack by David Fisher.
You know, I saw the movie when that came out called The Pack with Joe Don Baker is in the lead.
Okay.
And if you might remember Joe Don Baker, he was the detective in the Cape Fear remake.
Oh, okay.
And he was also Sheriff Buford Pusser in Walking Tall.
Interesting. Was it a theatrical release or made for TV? Do you know?
I think that was a theatrical release, and Killer Dogs was kind of a thing for a little while. Did you ever watch Little House on the Prairie? Were you forced to watch that as a kid?
Never did, no.
All right.
I'm familiar with it. It was always on, but I avoided it like the plague.
All right, so there's a Little House on the Prairie episode, and it's about killer dogs that get rabies, and they attack the family.
Yeah.
And so these wild dogs terrorize Walnut Grove, which is the town, but it was pretty controversial at the time.
Wow.
So anyway, that's my killer dog story.
Had I known that Little House on the Prairie had plots like that, I might have been down with it. Right. Anyway, so Paperbacks from Hell features profiles 3 books by an author named Edmund Plante, Plante, with the scariest one they talk about being called Seed of Evil, about a haunted or possessed evil kid with glowing yellow eyes and evidently a giant dong. It looks really disturbing. But you recently read and reviewed another book by that author called Trapped. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, this is my first experience with Edmund Plante. He authored at least 7 horror novels, from what I could tell, from 1979 to 1993. This one, Trapped, was published in 1989 by BMI, which is really just a subsidiary of Dorchester, like the popular publisher Leisure Fiction. And like your earlier review with The Pack, this novel actually begins with the Hunter family arriving at a secluded mountain cottage for a summer vacation. Now, Keith, he's the husband, and he's had some sort of affair with another woman, and his wife Maggie found out about it. So this vacation is to sort of rekindle their love with each other and to create a stronger bond. Along with Keith and Maggie is their teen children Bryce and Tony's friend Lisa, and Maggie's elderly mother Vivian, because anyone wanting to rekindle their marriage brings their mom, right? All right, so the family's first night is wild. They hear this strange humming sound, and lo and behold, there's this UFO that's landed near the cottage. And I don't know why I'm laughing so much at this. So the hunters discovered that this next morning, and in pure panic, they attempt to drive away and learn that the entire cottage and surrounding lake and forest has been placed in a clear dome. Did you ever read Stephen King's Under the Dome?
Yeah, Under the Dome. I like that book.
Same story here. So
okay.
Maybe he borrowed.
It's also the Simpsons movie.
Okay, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
All right, so the hunters find that they have no way to leave. There's no way to escape. So by nightfall, the hunters are attacked by these colorful winged creatures that seemingly can control their minds and actions. So the creatures, they don't really do anything at first, and they just sort of fly around and create shock and awe. Remember, these creatures are only targeting this family and this cottage, so there's nothing else that we know of. But here's the thing, they don't come out in the daylight. They don't like the sun. So during the day, the hunter family can just do whatever they want. But at night, they know that these creatures are going to smash windows and just, try to scare everyone. Keith's the dad, and he's the husband. He's the guy who should be doing preventive things. But, I don't know, maybe take down some doors, put them over the windows, maybe use the car to pull down some trees or shrubs to use as a barricade. Maybe watch Night of the Living Dead before going on summer vacation that involves survival horror elements. But he didn't, and the reader suffers for it. Tom, I hated this book so much.
Really?
And for a variety of reasons.
Sort of a fun premise.
There's so many things wrong with it. So the family, for starters, doesn't do anything to defend themselves with. They've got a lamp and a fireplace poker, nothing else. And because these creatures or aliens can use mind control, They cause Vivian to have this weird romance with her dead husband. For Keith, they make him have sexual desires for his daughter's best friend, Lisa, which is like 14.
Oh, boy.
And Lisa, and I'm not sure if she's controlled or not, but she's all over Keith and wanting a father figure to do the nasty with. So Keith and Lisa get it on, and Tori ends up watching the whole thing. And then Maggie finds out, and there's all this family drama that suffocates the whole story because the daughters watch the dad have sex with her friend. And to make matters worse, the author writes whole chapters from the perspective of the mother creature. So there's not even any mystery here.
Yeah.
There's no anticipation of some grand reveal. You know there's aliens there. You know that they're attacking the family and experimenting on them. It's just dumb. And it's a dumb family. It's dumb creatures. It's a dumb story. It's a dumb book. And it's 344 pages of this.
Oh, man.
Anyhow, this one's called Trapped by Edmund Plant, and it is truly a paperback from hell.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, sorry to force you to read that at the tip of a sword. Now, on the cover of the Paperbacks from Hell book, there's a collage of cover scans showing several of the paperbacks discussed inside the book. But only one of these covers actually made me cringe and want to hide under the covers. That book was called Spawn by Sean Hutson. Sean is spelled S-H-A-U-N, and Hudson is H-U-T-S-O-N. Now, the cover depicts a menacing-looking baby or fetus behind a mason jar containing a very frightened and screaming man.
It made me think of that movie Basket Case, where the monster's in the baby stroller. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, so against the protests of every frightened cell in my body, I decided to read Spawn. So British horror author Sean Houston, his writing career took off in 1982 with the publication of an iconic paperback called Slugs. Yes, it's about shell-free killer gastropod mollusks. He found his niche as a great storyteller who can weave compelling suspense stories out of a crazy, gross-out premise. And that's really the idea behind this 1983 book that I read called Spawn. It delivers on the promise of being about murderous, aborted fetuses. But the novel is also about more than that. Try to keep your composure, Eric. This is serious literature we're talking about. So the book opens in 1946 in Great Britain, and Harold, the son of a prostitute, is a seriously messed up kid. At age 14, he occupies his time torturing insects with fire. So this diversion leads to a fiery death of his mom and baby brother while leaving Harold grotesquely deformed without a person in the world who cares about him. So we rejoin Harold in 1982, where he's been a resident of a mental institution, undergoing intense psychological and physical therapy for 35 years. He actually is kind of a sweet, shy, polite, and severely scarred young man. The dilapidated asylum that he lives in is closing, and it's time for Harold to rejoin society. He's hired as a janitor at a local hospital. The facility has a basement pathology lab where a giant furnace incinerates the body parts, organic materials, and aborted fetuses from various medical procedures. Come on, stop laughing. It's a serious book. The sight of a fetus in the incinerator brings back awful memories to Harold when he's thinking about his baby brother's death by fire. And so what Harold starts doing is he starts swiping the fetuses and burying them near the hospital so they don't suffer the indignity of the consuming fires. Then something happens that I'm not going to spoil here, but the means by which Harold's fetus friends are eventually reanimated and come back to life wasn't particularly realistic, but you don't go to these books for realism. I can't imagine a situation where the results would ever seem reasonable, and he had to get to that point to write this book. Meanwhile, there's this subplot where there's a violent murderer named Harvey who escaped from a prison and has spent most of his time in solitary confinement. And there's two smart police inspectors heading up the manhunt in hopes of catching this maniac before the body count mounts. The subplot was interesting enough, but the eventual link to Harold and his fetus gang was kind of inconsequential. Harold seems to have a real interest in keeping his fetus friends alive. And it's pretty stomach-turning, and I don't want to give too much away, but they develop a taste for human blood, and so just leave it at that. Spawn is a very fun and bloody bit of escapism, but there's also some interesting themes running through the narrative about kind of fetuses and whether it's a person or not. But I can't imagine that either the pro-life or the pro-choice side of the abortion debate wants to claim Harold's zombie fetuses as their own. And as a novel, I thought it was entertaining. It was very much a gross-out paperback. You're going to cringe. You're going to squirm. You're probably not going to be frightened, but you're also not going to be able to put the paperback down because it's well-written and it's compelling as hell. you're going to want to see what Houston is going to do next with his book. You probably know if you're going to like this type of thing or not. And if so, if this is your type of thing, you're going to enjoy this bloody ride. Again, that's Spawn by Sean Hutson, Hutsom. Well, Eric, that's about all the horror content I planned for this spooky episode. Is there anything you wanted to add or talk about?
I'm really excited about this episode and the idea that we can now gingerly throw a few vintage horror titles into our mix. And I have a good idea on which ones I'm going to read and review next. And honestly, they could be suspense mystery fiction or plain old horror. It's a thin line sometimes between the genres.
Right. I got a couple other vintage and pulp horror topics I want to touch upon later in October, but we'll mix it up with our regular crime and adventure stuff so we don't alienate our core audience. Anyway, Eric, so if you don't have anything else, why don't you just talk us out?
Thanks, Tom. This wraps up another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter to join the conversation and see this awesome cover art from all these books we discuss here on the show. Our email address is paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com. And please join us every day at paperbackwarrior.com for the finest reviews and features about vintage paperback fiction. This is Eric on behalf of Tom saying we will see you next Monday for an all-new episode.